Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello everyone, my name is Hasna Nurfadhilah. I'm from A1 class 2023 and today I wanted to explain the material about theory of translation. Translation studies. Process of translation between two different written languages involves the translator changing an original written text or source text in the original verbal language or the source language into a written text or the target text in a different verbal language or the target language. Throughout story, written and spoken translation have played a crucial role in interhuman communication, not least in providing access to important texts for scholarship and religious purposes. Yet the study of translation as an academic subject has only really begun in the past 60 years. In the English-speaking world, this discipline is now generally known as translation studies. The study of translation developed into an academic discipline only in second half of the 20th century. First, medium-restricted theories. Second, area-restricted theories. Third, range-restricted theories. Fourth, text-type restricted theories. Fifth, the term time-restricted. And the last one is problem-restricted theories. Translation for the professional translator is a consonant learning cycle that moves through the stage of instinct, experience, and habit, and within experience through the stage of addition, induction, and deduction. The style of translation process are experience and habit. Experience, especially fresh, novel, even shocking experience, the experience of taking something familiar apart and seeing how it was put together, is in most way the opposite of habit, even though in another form, processed, repeat, and sublimated. It is very stuff of habit, the material that habit is made from. Habit. Translator need habit in order to speed up the translation process and make it more enjoyable. But they also need new experiences to enrich it and complicate it, slow it down, and again to make it more enjoyable. Type of translation. There are 5 types of translation. First, dynamic translation. Dynamic translation is also called as pair translation. In the process of translation, the meaning from source language is conveyed by using the natural expression in the target language. Second, pragmatic translation. Pragmatic translation focuses in the accuracy of the information conveyed by source language. This translation doesn't pay much attention to aspects in source language. Third, aesthetic poetic translation. This type of translation focuses on the aspect of aesthetic, feelings, and emotion. We can find aesthetic poetic translation in the translation of literary works. Fourth, ethnography translation. Ethnography translation purpose is to explain the cultural context of source language and target language. Translator must be able to consider the different use of words which have similar forms and meaning in one language. And fifth, linguistic translation. Linguistic translation is just translation contains linguistic information that is implicit in the source language made explicit in the target language. Translation method. There are 2 types of translation method. First is source text and second is target text. Source text. First, word for word. Newmark states that word for word translation method, words on the target text are usually written after or under the source text. This method is also called as an interlinear translation. For example, this oil contains low fat but high calories. Minyak ini mengandung kadar lemak yang rendah tetapi berkalori tinggi. Second, literal translation. The translator usually translate the source text first, like word-for-word translation, then adjusting the word arrangement based on the target grammar. For example, this oil contains low fat but high calories. Minyak ini mengandung lemak rendah tetapi berkalori tinggi. Third is faithful translation. translator tries to reproduce contextual meaning from source text accurately to paying attention with grammatical structure of target text. For example, Jack is too well aware that he is naughty. Jack menyadari terlalu baik bahwa ia nakal. And last one is semantic translation. This method considers the aesthetic text of source language through compromising the meaning as long as it still can be understood. For example, he is wearing a heavy jacket. Dia memakai sebuah jaket yang tebal. Target text. First, adaptation. It can be said as the first form of translation. For example, hey Jude, don't make it bad. Take a bad song and make it better. Remember to let her into your heart, then you can start to make it better. Kasih, di manakah? Mengapa kau tinggalkan aku? Ingatlah kau padaku. Janji setiamu takkan kulupa. Second is free translation. Focus on content of source text. The result can be longer than the source text. It is usually paraphrased. For example, it's raining cat and dog. Hujan yang sangat lebat. Third, idiomatic. Idiomatic translation uses a natural form in the text in the target language is in accordance with its grammatical construction and lexical choices. For example, I can relate to that. Aku mengerti maksudnya. And fourth, communicative. Translating contextual meaning in the text source language, both linguistic and linguistic aspect content, so that it can be accepted and understood by target language. For example, beware of the dog. Awas anjing galak. Translation technique. Basic technical characteristic of translation. 1. Translation technique have an influence. Translation technique. Basic technical characteristic. Translation. 1. Translation technique have an influence on translation result. 2. Translation technique compare with source language and basic source. 3. Translation technique have an influence on the smallest unit of text, for example, words, paraphrase, and sentences. 4. Translation technique are discursive, natural, and contextual. 5. Translation technique are functional. Translation technique indirect technique. 1. Borrowing. Translation technique by taking word or expression directly from another language. Usually, the word or expression borrowed and pure or without change. For example, computer to computer. 2. Colloquy. Colloquy is a technique that translates foreign word or phrase into target language by adapting the structure of the target language. For example, beautiful girl, gadis cantik. 3. Literal. This translation technique tries to translate a word or expression effectively word by word. For example, I go to school. Saya pergi ke sekolah. Translation technique in indirect technique. First, transposition, changing grammatical categories. For example, a pair of glasses, sepasang kacamata. 2. Modulation, changing the point of view or cognitive category. For example, the problem is hard to solve. Masalah itu sukar dipecahkan. 3. Compensation, introducing information or stylistic effect that can be directly translated. For example, me, apa? 4. Adaptation, replacing cultural elements with suitable equivalent in the target culture. For example, dear sir, yang terhormat. 5. Description, replacing term with description. For example, cow creamer, poci berbentuk sapi untuk tempat susu. 6. Established equivalent, using recognized equivalent in the target language. For example, well, sumur. 7. Discursive creation, using out of context equivalence. For example, he went to Jakarta last week. Ia meninggalkan Jakarta minggu lalu. 8. Generalization, using more general terms. For example, she was letting her temper go by inches. Dia sedikit demi sedikit kehilangan kesabarannya. 9. Particularism. Using more specific terms. For example, window, jendela toko. 10. Reduction. Reducing information in the target language. For example, just and equitable treatment, hubungan yang adil. 11. Substitution. Changing linguistic element with paralinguistic ones. For example, Arab gesture with thank you. 12. Variation. Changing elements to affect language variation. For example, tone, style, dialect. Translation technique and combination technique. First, single technique. Using one technique for a translation. For example, borrowing. Second, triplet. Using two techniques. For example, transposition and modulation. Third, triplet. Using three techniques. For example, addition, modulation, and reduction. And fourth, quadruplet. Using four techniques. For example, reduction, transposition, addition, and borrowing. Translation procedures. Procedure is strategy used by the translation for solve internal problems based translation process in the translation's own goals. Shape, shift, transposition. A translation procedure that involves changing grammatical form, source language to basic language. First, shift in obligatory and automatic form are caused by language system and rules. Second, the shift is due to a grammatical structure in the source language that doesn't exist in the target language. Third, the shift is due to reasons of naturalness of expression, the source language equivalent in unnatural of rigid in the target language. Fourth, unit shifts. For example, words into praise and praise into clause are often encountered in translating loose words. Shape shift transposition. Shift in meaning are shared into two, namely modulation mandatory and free modulation. One, mandatory modulation done when a word or source language phrase is missing the equivalent in the target language, so needs to appear. 2. Free modulation translation procedure done because non-linguistic reason. For example, for clarify meaning, give rise to meaning relationship in target language, looking for a match that feels naturally the basic language. Naturalization. 1. Transfer and adapt source language word first into the pronunciation normal. 2. Transfer and adapt it into normal word formation. Contextual matching. Placement of information in context, so that the meaning is clear to recipient of information. Note matching. Translation procedure used if the translator translates the word or equivalent expression, the lexical is completely absent from the target language. Literal translation. Varieties of close translation. Word-for-word translation, one-to-one translation, literal translation. Translation of poetry, faithful and false friend, word in their context, elegant variation, back translation task, accepted translation, constraint on literal translation, natural translation, recreative translation, literary translation, the subtext, the notion of the non-equivalent word, and the role of context. Translation and culture. Culture is the way of life and its manifestation that are peculiar to a community that use a particular language as its means of expression. General consideration. The things that translators should consider in translating cultural words. 1. Motivation cultural. 2. Specialist. 3. Linguistic level of readership. Cultural categories. 1. Material culture. 2. Social culture. 3. Organization. 4. Gesture and habits. And 5. Ecology. Okay guys, I think enough for me. Thank you for your attention. And wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.